Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Alex Kisling. I'm Vice President of Communications here at CSIS, and we're delighted to welcome all of you here for this conversation with Frank Lavin, the author of this terrific new book, Inside the Reagan White House. Frank, welcome back to CSIS, and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. Great to be back. Hello to friends, old and new, and it's great to have this conversation.
Looking forward to it. Before we dive in, I want to make sure everyone understands Frank's full professional background. It's a resume that is as impressive as it is lengthy. Frank began his career serving in several roles throughout the 8 years of the Reagan Administration, including positions at the Office of Presidential Personnel, Office of Public Liaison. He rose through the ranks to serve as Deputy Executive Secretary at the National Security Council and finally as Director of Political Affairs. Frank went on to serve as Undersecretary for International Trade at the Commerce Department under President George H.W. Bush. From 2001 through 2005, he served under President George W. Bush as U.S. Ambassador to Singapore. He served in several senior finance and management roles in the private sector. Currently a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and we're honored to say he was previously a visiting fellow at CSIS. And most importantly, like me, he's a proud son of the great state of Ohio. Yeah. So everyone please give Frank a warm welcome.
Thank you.
This is truly an insider's look at the Reagan administration, and I want to cover a number of areas here, and also we'll be taking time for audience Q&A, so please tee up your questions. And I want to look back at some key moments that occurred in the administration, lessons that can be applied today. But let's start broadly. It's been over 40 years since Reagan was first elected. So why now?
Yeah. Well, that is part of the reason. Is I think every president is judged in the immediacy of his time in office purely along ideological lines. If you more or less like the person or agreed with what he's trying to do, you more or less say he did a good job. And if you didn't, you say, well, he must have done a bad job. And only with the passage of time do we develop a more elevated view to say, all right, I wasn't that excited about that person necessarily when he was president, but I think he at least tried to do in his heart what he thought was the right thing. And by the way, he might have actually been right. So everybody gets a second look after time, the passage of time. And I think we're in that moment with Reagan now, that there were a group of Reagan supporters, such as myself, who said, look, I think he's on the right track. I think he's trying to take America the right direction. But there were opponents who said he's not. He's not taking America the right way. But I think now you get a broader understanding of his program and his ideals.
Great. I just want to give everybody the context and the perspective you're bringing to this book, and kind of through the lens of your own personal political evolution as a young man. You caught the political bug early in life, working on campaigns and being, having that political acumen at a very young age. Your first vote cast ever was not for Ronald Reagan. In fact, it was against Ronald Reagan. In the 1976 GOP primary against President Ford. So tell us about kind of your personal political evolution and what ultimately led you on the path to jump on the Reagan bandwagon.
Yeah, and I want to say in my defense, Mike Deaver was in the same category. His first vote was against Ronald Reagan in the gubernatorial primary in California in '66. Caspar Weinberger's first vote was against Ronald Reagan. Same thing. They're both for.
You're in good company. Then.
I'm in good company. Also, I think the validity of Reagan's point of view holds greater attraction the more you deal with it. So some people get it right away, and I was not in that category. And also, I have to tell you, this is sort of a cultural comment, that I have sort of establishment impulses, and I was not against the idea. I was not for the idea of deposing an incumbent president, President Ford. Although, look, he was plagued with problems. It was not because he was not elected. He was inherited the office from Nixon. Departure, so he was sort of troubled to begin with, so to speak, politically troubled. Right. So if you were ever going to do it, that would be the time to do it. But I still felt uncomfortable that Nixon's resignation was enough of a deposing of a leader, and we just didn't need to do this sequentially. So that was part of it, was sort of a bias for continuation of the status quo. But part of it was Reagan, to my mind, represented what needed to be done, but did he also represent risk or a cost? And if you're trying to change things, there is a risk and a cost. And Reagan did represent change. And so what Reagan had to do, and he certainly convinced me, is that the cost or risk associated with his changes were not only acceptable, but they were far lower cost than not changing. And the core issue here, to my mind, was Cold War management. And we had a bipartisan consensus in the 1970s that in some fashion deemed the status quo to be acceptable, meaning a long-term deadlock between East and West. And that was accepted across political philosophies, that was accepted across political parties, and there was nothing that could be done about it. And to try to do something about it risked nuclear tension or some other terrible outcome, and so we're just better off just maintaining the free world as it was and not really trying to change. Reagan said that's unacceptable. Reagan said we can do it, and morally we should do it. And to come to agreement with that is a bit of a journey for a lot of people. And I think Washington establishment, when he first promulgates that, is overwhelmingly skeptical or hostile to this view. But he said, I can do this in an orderly fashion. I understand cost benefit. I am not reckless when it comes to foreign policy management. And I'm going to take allies with us, and I'm going to put pressure on the Soviets, and we're going to prevail in the end. And that was a hell of a journey. That was real leadership, where he really shifted U.S. foreign policy, and he won. So good for him.
I'm going to do some name dropping here because your journey, even before you joined the White House, you kind of started with college Republicans at the RNC, where you worked under then chairman of the college Republicans, Karl Rove, who I understand was at your wedding.
He was my best man.
Yeah,
he was my best man.
You served.
I was his best man too.
Were you really?
2 out of 3 times.
I didn't know that. You worked on the 1970 Texas AG race under a candidate named James Baker.
Yep.
This is really kind of, at an early age, you're working with a who's who of who would define the Republican Party for decades to come.
But let me tell you, it's sort of the CSIS model, meaning one of the wonderful things about American society, American culture, is its open architecture. If you've got a good idea, there's no better place in the world to have a good idea than the United States. And you can talk about it, discuss it, evaluate it, critique it, publish it. But the point is, it's not dependent on your age or your academic pedigree. Yep. It's dependent on the worthiness of your idea. And whether that's in business or in policy, it's a nation that respects creativity or innovation. And so I'd say the trouble with academia for me was that it was not of that culture. It was a more formalized, hierarchical, step-by-step, year-by-year. Well, look, we had to do it. You had to get your formal education. But politics is open architecture.
Yeah.
The person in the room who's got the best idea is going to have currency and going to have some say in what takes place. And we're going to respect that person. We're going to want to hear more from that person. So politics, to my mind, was fantastic with that attribute.
I agree. I totally agree. I want to transition into the White House now. Reagan wins in 1980, defeats Carter. Yeah. You land in what is essentially kind of an unpaid clerkship role in the Office of Presidential Personnel, helping to staff out the new administration. And I think that, as you write in your book, you observed very early on that there was something special and unique about this White House culture. Yeah. Not only in the president himself, but in the staff he built around him, and it was a mix of, it was a pretty eclectic mix of individuals, but you had the true believers, as you describe them, versus the pragmatists. Yeah. Talk about that early White House staff.
And can I just make one comment? There's one other stepping stone in what you just described, if I may. In 1980, I'm not a college graduate, I'm an undergraduate, and I connect with a guy who is running, at that time, the largest independent expenditure operation in the country. Terry Dolan running NICPAC, and they're all for Reagan. And he says, we need you to help with ads. We need you to help crafting and producing advertisements for Reagan. And the good news is, we won't pay you. And, but you are now part of a national campaign. You're now shaping the message and the argument for Ronald Reagan. And if that's payment, you ought to take the job. And I said, this is great. This is glorious. I thought this is fantastic. This is so much more intriguing than schoolwork. I mean, this.
A low bar,
Yeah, exactly. But I'm actually making a difference. I'm actually contributing to the conversation. So I got involved with the Reagan campaign, with the Reagan IE effort in 1980. That was terrific. That was a lot of fun. And then I went right to a volunteer again in the transition office, you said, and then into the White House in January '81.
So talk about that cultural dynamic in the White House, and you said it was really the right mix of the pragmatist versus the true believers.
I think so.
And both were needed.
Look, Reagan came into office with a sense of mission, and I would say there are two attributes of leadership that Reagan encompassed. One is he could articulate a vision. Where did America need to go? What needed to happen to make the country a better place? So he came into office with a vision. And he also believed, and the second pillar is creating a consensus for action. You've got to sell your ideas. You've got to get 51% behind you, so to speak. And you've got to be able to take this forward through a legislative system and get accepted by the country. But you had, because of that first point, and also, look, he had run, even in '68, he had a short-lived campaign. In '76, he had a very, very serious campaign. And in 1980, he had a successful campaign. But so he had a national reputation, a national following, a national brand of true believers or enthusiasts who had worked with him over years to craft budget proposals, foreign policy, defense. So people like Marty Anderson and Dick Allen, who ended up playing senior roles in the government, they're all from this campaign pedigree where they'd worked with him for years doing that. So you had this great benefit of a depth of talent when he came in. That's more of the true believer side. I'd say you need to, Reagan also, look, this guy served for 8 years as governor. So he respects the legislative process, the budget process. He knows he's got to work within a system. So you better have people in there who can cut the deal. At some point, you push the argument as far as you can push it. If you've got your 51%, congratulations. If you're at 45%, you say, all right, let's bring in some folks who can help me and figure out a way. As my friend says, the two kind of people in politics are the priests and the mathematicians. And you want both. You want the priests who say, I speak the holy word, I know the truth. And you want the mathematicians who say, that's great, your holiness, but we need to get to 51%. And how you keep a balance between those two tribes, if you will, is the genius. So, and the emblematic representative of those two tendencies in the West Wing were Jim Baker and Ed Meese. No doubt Meese was a true believer. No doubt Jim Baker is the mathematician, to saying you can believe whatever you want to believe, but unless we get that bill through Congress, we're not going to win.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You have this special team there, the good mix of pragmatists versus true believers, and you have the benefit of a president who's obviously known as the Great Communicator. I think there's a real contrast to draw between how the Reagan administration approached communications and public outreach versus what we see, in politics today.
I think so.
What was the overall strategy of the White House as you're coming in to the view on public engagement, how to leverage it for advancing the president's agenda, and how do you strategically lean on Reagan's skills as a communicator? That's something that's valuable but could be squandered if not used the right way.
Yeah. Reagan had a public persona for decades in movies and television, president of the Screen Actors Guild, governor of California, and then sort of a conservative movement leader. So he not only was comfortable with public communications, he believed this was intrinsic to his role, that he could define where he wanted to go best through a public outreach mechanism. And the least effective way of deciding where you want to go is some sort of staff meeting. So maybe somebody has to do that. That's part of the process, but it's more effective just to speak to the nation directly. Reagan said he became a huge fan of radio, and he went into radio. He was initially a sports broadcaster because of Franklin Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats. And he voted for FDR all 4 times. He was a Democrat, and he even then became a left-wing Democrat, and then he moved to the right in the 40s and 50s. But even in 1960, he was California head of Democrats for Nixon. So he was still had a D next to his name rather than an R, even as late as 1960. But he discusses FDR and FDR's speech. FDR was the first president, because of technology, who could communicate nationally, that you had national radio chains, and he did, and FDR understood the medium. And there were 2 innovations FDR made that Reagan loved and used. One was prior to Franklin Roosevelt, when radio carried a speech, It was an analog to an actual speaking event. That the President of the United States is now speaking to the New York Chamber of Commerce, and we're going to carry this live so you can hear it. So you are now sort of in the backdrop of this event. FDR said, look, that second part isn't necessary. You don't need the event. You don't need people in the room. You can speak to the nation directly, right? Which nowadays we'd say it's a kind of self-evident, but he was the first person who did it. And Reagan said that's absolutely right. And the other innovation of FDR in his speaking style was he spoke, and despite it's a mass audience, a multi-million numbered audience, speak to individuals, speak to one person. You are, although your audience might be 10, 20, 30 million, use a tone of voice and a diction connectivity of one person. And Reagan was very good at that. Reagan would speak to, you know, the National Association of Auto Dealers or somebody, but he would say, what are you going to say to a young married couple that comes into your dealership and needs a new car because they're expecting their first child? So he humanizes it, and every auto dealer's had this issue, right? And then he might back that into interest rates or back that into tariffs or something else, but he's starting at an individual level and he's speaking to the individual person.
About as effective as anybody I've seen.
Yeah, and look, there's a stylistic element too, which is kind of cultural. You talked about contrast today. Reagan believed in always trying to position your message to be as inviting as possible to everybody. I want anybody from any walk of life to be able to feel comfortable with what I'm saying. I don't want to denigrate anybody. I don't want to only speak to my base, but I want to speak to middle America. And I'm hoping that middle America comes with me. I ascribe that to Hollywood because you had this tendency, not so much today, but in the 1930s, that studio releases were much less frequent, and every single movie had to appeal to every single person. So every single Western, for example, was also a romance. So there's also somebody who's going to fall in love. And by the way, every single Western was not just that had a romantic story, but also had an animal in it, and also had a kid in it, and also had a gunfight in it. And you said, yeah, because that's all we're serving this month is we got a Western. So everybody's got to love this thing. We want, you know, single women and white-collar professionals and everybody to go to this movie. So we're going to have something for. So his speeches, his belief was, I need everybody from any walk of life to feel comfortable with what I'm saying.
It was the consensus building versus where I think we are, you know, probably today. On both sides is trying to, you know, rally the base and speak to them. I want to go through several kind of key moments throughout our discussion, but we have to talk about one that happened very early on in the presidency. 3 months in, March 30th, 1981, there's the attempt on President Reagan's life outside of the Washington Hilton. Tell me about the scene in the White House that day, and perhaps more importantly, did the events that day change the trajectory of the administration and how Reagan approached things, had it otherwise not happened, or was it just kind of a blip, albeit a very tragic blip?
Well, I was there, but I'm there one step removed from the immediacy of the news because I'm a junior staffer. And also, this is pre-information age, pre-digital age. So literally, if you are working in the White House or the OEOB, you are seeking out a senior staffer's office because they would typically have a TV set in it. And if you were very senior, if you were a White House communications director, Pat Buchanan, what you had were 3 TV sets on the shelf, all turned on, and you just controlled what to mute or not. But you couldn't easily change channels or surf channels, so you just had three TV sets on, and you kind of watch them all. And whenever somebody cut away live to the hospital, you'd say, turn that one on, and whenever somebody else cut it, you move back and forth. So there's this electricity, there's this spike of anxiety, of concern, of rumors. What did you expect? Panic is too strong a word because the system all kind of worked, but there was this enormous shock to the system. Reagan has extraordinary dignity in his ability to tell a joke as he comes out of surgery. Honey, I forgot to duck. But it's a signal of reassurance because it tells the American public, look, if this guy's making sort of corny jokes, it can't be that bad. The guy's got to be okay, right? Although he was at death's door. I mean, we know after the fact it was a serious attempt. But then there was always just second-order effects, which sometimes are more important. I mean, one of the telling moments, there are several telling moments. One of the telling moments is Vice President Bush is on some kind of speaking swing, I think in Texas, and he gets informed on Air Force Two, you better get back, the president's shot, not necessarily knowing all the details. And he lands at Andrews Air Force Two and is asked, do you want to take the helicopter to the White House? You're playing some kind of leadership role. We don't know how bad it is with the president, but you are the vice president, so let's go. Vice President Bush said, the only person who lands on the South Lawn is the president. So respect for the boss, dignity of the office, and I think also wisely not to, somebody's going to say it's being opportunistic or weird that he would assert himself as a, so he had a sense of dignity as well. And I say this, unfortunately, I think his heart was sort of in the right place, but the guy who stylistically mishandled the moment, forgive me if relatives are here, was Al Haig. And Al Haig goes after a NSC meeting where they're discussing what's happening going. Al Haig says, I will give the briefing. And they hadn't really been coordinated, and we hadn't really thought through, he hadn't really thought through what his message was. And he, for whatever set of reasons, decided to run up those steps from the sit room to the press room. He was a little red, a little puffy, and he said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm in charge, which had to be one of the least reassuring statements. I mean, let's just say there's other ways he could have said the national security team is meeting and we're comfortable with where we stand and we're in communications with the hospital, and that would have just been a more reassuring way of putting it. And
as a comms guy, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so yeah, if your boss is ever shot, God forbid, do not go running up and saying, I'm in charge. So I just raised a lot of questions. Then he misspoke in terms of constitutional succession. And again, instead of being reassuring, it was sort of unsettling. Yeah. And I think, you know, he left not just because of that, but I think that was sort of the beginning of the end of his tenure. So.
Yeah. Let's turn now to foreign policy, and again, we'll kind of start broadly here. Obviously, the Cold War is dominating the landscape. Yeah. Nuclear issues front and center. What was, generally speaking, President Reagan's approach to foreign policy decision-making? How did he strike a balance, and you cover this a bit in the book, between realism and idealism? And then I want you to touch upon this because I was not as familiar with this phrase. The principle of being a minute early versus a minute late.
A minute late.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say, look, that's the key foreign policy decision, regardless of political party or philosophy, the president has to decide. But and for most of U.S. history, we decided we're better off if we're a minute late. We don't need a standing army. We have no international ambitions. We have no enemies. We're not part of these European competition. So it's sort of a waste. It's sort of an unnecessary expenditure of effort and money to undertake international leadership. So we can wait. And I said, just as an observer, being a minute late has a lot of advantages. In fact, it's definitely the right course if no one ever presents a bill. And the lesson that Ronald Reagan saw, that our country saw, was in December 1941, Japan presented the bill. Say you don't have a military, you don't have any friends. Why should we respect your position? Why should we treat you as neutral? Why shouldn't we push you? And so our World War II leadership came out of it, shifted dramatically from being a minute late to being a minute early, to say we need a standing military. This is a world in which hard power counts. And if you want to be taken seriously, if you want deterrence to work, you better have something to say for yourself. So that's important. And the second lesson of World War II was alliances matter, friends matter, mutual defense. We never in the history of the United States had peacetime treaties. So we don't need them. And during World War II and after World War II, we said we do need them. And we helped construct the treaty organizations to say, let's have mutual defense treaties so we have force multipliers, so we have friends. Similarly, we had never had forward deployment, which is what you call when you have U.S. forces stationed overseas, not rotating, but actually U.S. military facilities overseas. We'd never had that in U.S. history. We said, we're better off. We're not doing this for frivolous reasons or generosity or charitable reasons. We're doing this for our own reasons, is that we want to try to shape outcomes internationally, and forward deployment and treaties and friends give us a better voice in that situation. But that dominated all during the Cold War. That was, no question, was a part of Reagan's approach. Now, there's different degrees of orthodoxy, different shades of gray in this, but I think most U.S. presidents adhered to this, and it lasted from World War II through the Cold War. And I would say for a decade or two after the Cold War, that was still dominant. But because you had personal relationships and people who remembered this architecture, and so it had a certain momentum. But in the last 10 years or so, it's faded quite a bit. And the governing sentiment, I think in both parties, there's a strong sentiment to saying, you know what, the smart thing to do is to be a minute late.
Yeah.
The friends don't get you that far. Foreign policy doesn't get you that far. There can even be indirect costs. You can overshoot. You can get in the wrong kind of conflicts. So we're better off just pulling back from a minute early. It's a spectrum. It's an incremental change, but there's no question that changes.
No, I think that's right. I mean, that's the big debate today. I mean, I want to focus, on how the White House and President Reagan, viewed direct engagement with the Soviets, and you lay out, 6 kind of key principles that framed Reagan's thinking around dealing with the Soviets. I wonder if you could kind of talk us through at least some of those, and whether those approaches are applicable today.
Okay, I think I mentioned 1 or 2. I think I mentioned hard power. You better be serious about defense. 2 was economic growth, right? So you need economic growth, not just to fund the defense, but also to keep the American people on your side. We've seen this with several presidents. If the economy is performing, the American public will generally support what you're doing. And if the economy isn't performing, then there's a lot of skepticism or even opposition to what you do. So you better get economic growth on track. You better have a strong military. I think alliances and treaty management was a big part of it too. Then 4th would be tech, that we can outperform the Soviets on technology. We've just got a better base. We've got more experimentation. We have venture capital. We have sort of a federal or a open system that allows for experimentation. And the Soviets don't have that. And so SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, plays a huge role, not just in the intrinsic value of being able to stop Soviet missiles, but as a metaphor or a signal to the Soviets, we can run faster than you can run. So think about what kind of race you want, because we're going to be able to outpace you. So how far do you want to go with this? All right, you got me. What was the last?
Let me go back to them.
Thank you.
I'm going to run down here. So we got get the economy moving again, articulate an affirmation of liberty and Western values, rebuild America's defenses, focus on technology, raise the cost of Soviet adventurism. Okay,
so 2 other things. One is this adventurism point means, look, the Soviets, even Walter Mondale said this, the Soviets are like the hotel thief that goes down the corridors checking to see which door is not locked. They are just opportunistic. They're predatory and they're opportunistic, right? And so if there is a rickety government someplace that has sort of an undercurrent of domestic opposition, they'll pile into that. They'll say, let's make a bad situation worse. Let's get a communist person. And they were very active in the Third World, politically, funding guerrilla movements. And they had a reasonable amount of success. So part of Reagan's view was, let's raise the cost of that kind of behavior. Let's fund our guerrilla movements. Let's support the governments in place. Let's push them to reform. El Salvador goes through land reform and human rights training. We need these governments to improve, to reduce the space for the communists to operate. But we also need to make life tougher for the communists. So we did this in Africa, did this in Central America, did this in Afghanistan. That raising the cost of Soviet adventurism was a big part of Reagan's agenda. And critically, and I'd say maybe even number 1, was this point on global communications, that it wasn't just geopolitical competition, but there was a moral dimension to this as well. When one group is democratic and has freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and political parties and freedom of religion, and the other side doesn't have this, say we shouldn't hesitate or shy away from putting a spotlight on this distance, that the Western system, with all of its imperfections, just provides better outcome. Market economics is going to have more broad-based prosperity than communism, and a democratic or liberty-oriented system respects human rights and allows people to live lives as they choose. And you can do that in France or Japan or the United States, and you sure can't do that in East Germany or the Soviet Union. So that was an important part of his messaging.
Yeah, very much so. Let's talk about another key moment, the summit in Reykjavik. This is October 1986. Reagan and Gorbachev get together to talk about nuclear issues. What I could tell from what you wrote, this was pretty hastily planned. It was announced 10 days ahead of the summit. For full context here, the Soviets obviously had a bit of a background in not, sticking with their agreements, maybe cheating, if you will.
Yeah.
But for the first time, we have a Soviet leader in Gorbachev who is, first time in a while at least, is really media and PR savvy.
Yes.
Knows how to work it. He has positioned himself as, in the anti-nuclear movement. So we have a kind of a foe here that is a challenge. You were at the National Security Council at this time, so you were quite involved in the planning and preparation for this summit. Would love to get some color from the ground. And what was President Reagan's mindset heading into those negotiations, and maybe more colorfully, what was his mindset coming out of those negotiations?
Yeah, and you framed this exactly right, Alex, in that Gorbachev was the first Soviet leader in something like over 40 years who was younger than his American counterpart. So they were always, the Brezhnev, Chernenko, Kirilenko types were aged, and they looked aged. And, they weren't good spokesman for the Soviet cause. So, but this is the first time you had a guy who had, a bit of a personality, a bit of a stage presence, had at least some media savvy. And you're also right, the very first question discussed about what was Reagan's view of foreign policy and how we're going to change U.S. foreign policy. And if you're going to change something, there can be anxiety and there can be an undercurrent of nervousness about the nature of the change. So there's a strong sort of human nature bias for don't change anything. Well, Gorbachev was smart enough to play into that. Gorbachev, and there's always, the Europeans were susceptible to this, some in America. You had a nuclear freeze movement to saying any movement on nuclear weapons is harmful. Now, some of this was genuine political expression. Some of this, though, was Soviet orchestrated. And you had huge protests and stigmatizing Reagan. He's a cowboy, he's a militarist, he's a madman. So doing what you can to stir up sort of European opposition, and some of this movement was in the United States as well. So Gorbachev had some cards to play. What I think he was most concerned about, and what Reykjavik centered on and fell apart on, was Strategic Defense Initiative. And Gorbachev's core goal of this discussion was to get the U.S. to commit to essentially ceasing development. There are permutations of his proposal, but the core element of it was no field testing. You may only pursue this in the laboratory, which means you really can't take it to a usable model. You can't deploy it if it's not been field tested. So it's a clever way of saying, I'm not really against you owning a car, but you may not take it out of the driveway or something like that. So, but look, Reagan's not, nobody fell for that. We know what you're saying. You're uncomfortable with my car. So Reagan had a number of counter proposals trying to show good faith and see what we can do with the Soviets. Gorbachev wasn't receptive. And I think I have a line in the book that the talks fell apart and eventually the Soviet Union fell apart as well. I think, by the way, there's a conversation Gorbachev has after he's left office that he has with George Shultz after Shultz has left office. And Gorbachev says, I think Reykjavik was the turning point. And what I took from that was this was his final effort to sort of dissuade Reagan from Reaganism, to say, can I stop, compete with this guy's doing, because I can't really compete with him, and I'm going to be ever weaker. So I've got to, and if I can't do that, which he couldn't, I have to look at internal reforms. And for whatever set of reasons, well, it makes you say, boy, Deng Xiaoping is sui generis. You'd think there'd be people in Russia every bit as smart as Deng Xiaoping, meaning Deng Xiaoping said, we're going to reform, but we're going to keep the Communist Party on top. And we're going to have prosperity because we're moving to market economics, but we're not giving up any political control. Gorbachev was not able to do that. Didn't have the economic literacy, didn't have the team, didn't have the agility, and the system crumbled. The system had not been performing, and there was no sort of legitimacy to it, and here we are.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great quote that he gave after leaving office. And But I mean, there was no negotiation success in Reykjavik. All was not lost. I mean,
Right.
a year later, there
Right.
was a deal struck. So I think there's, maybe you would argue that don't be afraid of failure.
Don't be afraid from walking away from the table.
Yep.
I'd say, and don't define success. Boy, I've spent a lot of time in China negotiations, and people, I think it's a psychological point. People say, if I got a photo between the two of us smiling at the end of the negotiations, that's success. And I'm saying, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's success. And maybe you'd be better off walking it away. And I've had this conversation with different other trade negotiators, and my point is, if you want China to move toward you, you need to move away from China. If you start moving toward China, they'll stop. They'll stop. They'll say, you're coming my way anyhow.
Yeah.
So you're not inducing better behavior. You've got to have some kind of stick mechanism, maybe some kind of carrot mechanism as well. But psychologically, we're used to, as Americans, we're used to good faith negotiations over kind of mechanical trade issues,
Right.
and if we sit down, we can solve this. And by the way, that's largely true with most trading partners. It is not particularly true with China.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, hard to argue against that. Reykjavik happens in October of '86. Late '86, you say, is kind of the low point
Yeah.
of the Reagan administration. The Republicans lost the Senate.
Yeah.
Democrats regained control.
Yeah.
The president's dealing with health issues.
Yeah.
And then Iran-Contra
Right.
breaks out.
Right.
I want to talk about it just for a minute because I think that, one, our younger audience members and viewers would benefit from a kind of a backgrounder on what exactly was happening there. But I mean, it had a pretty serious impact on the final years of the Reagan presidency. I mean, I think you wrote that Reagan went into 1987, with talks of impeachment.
Sure.
Although by the end of '88, he was the most popular president since Eisenhower.
You're right.
So,
You're right.
But it had a pretty. I mean,
It did.
impact,
It was
of course.
debilitating. It was debilitating. I think that period of danger or of impediment lasted maybe 6 to 12 months, but you don't know that except in retrospect. When you're in the middle of bad weather, you don't say, is this going to clean up in 6 weeks, or is this it? And only when the storm clouds pass, I bet you say, okay, we think that is behind us, we're back to our agenda again. But it was debilitating for, I would say, 6 to 12 months. And I'm not sure if anybody in good faith thought it was impeachable, but what it does is it gives permission to people who were hostile to you anyhow to be more hostile.
Sure.
And it gave them an effectiveness and a currency that they otherwise might not have had. You can't simply say, well, look, I don't like Reagan, I don't like where he's going, let's impeach him. But you can say, well, this is terrible what's happened here, and it looks to me to be impeachable. And look, there's a certain plausibility. I think that plausibility fell apart. But in the immediacy of the scandal, it's an open question. What did Reagan know, and when did he know it?
And it took a while to clear that up.
It took a while. Poindexter, so look, there's an enormous body of literature on this, but the 60-second summary is there are sort of two sets of problems, two sets of activities, each of which encompassed its own problems. And by problems, I mean political or legal or arguably impeachable. One was an effort to exchange arms for hostages with the Iranians, and the same Iranian team that's in today. So folks who aren't our friends, folks who act against U.S. interests, but because of their connection with Hezbollah, they had indirectly under their control U.S. hostages. And the word we is not appropriate here, but certain people in the U.S. government thought this is a good idea. We can exchange arms for hostages. This is fraught with issues, moral issues and legal issues. And historically, the U.S. position has always been the opposite. No arms for hostages because you are inducing the taking of more hostages. If you reward bad behavior, you are going to get more bad behavior. And you could say, boy, that's not very humane and it's cruel to be hostages. Those are the arguments on the other side. But watch out if you start feeding this beast, and again, the Iranian dictatorship, behaves in a pretty consistent pattern. So it's not a one-off activity by a criminal gang that just want money. You're rewarding a bad actor. So that was one set of issues. The other, and then there's related elements of that, like what was approved, what did the president know about, what did it cost, where did the funds come from, what happened, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all in that same orbit of issues. Then the second set of issues was, can we take some of the funds that might be made through transactions supplying the Iranians with weaponry and selling them, can we take some of that markup and give it to the Contras, which is the anti-Sandinista guerrilla movement, which had been funded by the U.S. and others, but Congress, you'll remember when, 87, Congress at some point passes what's called the Boland Amendment, and the Boland Amendment forbids U.S. government funds to support the Contras. But interestingly, it didn't speak to third-party funds, or if any other nation wanted to do it, or if the U.S. could solicit or facilitate funds from other nations. It just said no U.S. funds to this group. So it opens the door for good behavior and bad behavior. But by conflating these two problems, you've got a huge problem.
Right.
By saying we're going to do arms or hostages, don't worry, we're shaking money loose from the Iranians, it's okay, and don't worry, we're giving money to the Contras, but don't worry, it's not U.S. government money. And you say there's just a number of leaps that have to take place in that sequence for people to sort of accept it or be comfortable with it. And the whole thing blew up. The whole thing was uncovered and blew up, and so be it.
Yeah. I want to make sure we're already running short on time, so I want to make sure we allot some time here for audience questions. So if there are any questions in the audience, please feel to raise your hand, and we'll turn to you in just a second. I'm going to ask a big question that's going to require a short answer, so I apologize. Reaganomics, still hotly debated today. What's your view on what people don't understand today about it? What's the lasting impact some 40, 45 years later? And here we are again, decades later. Inflation, regulation, debt are top of mind and at the forefront of the policy debate.
I have this conversation a lot because it's intriguing to me and has a lot more to do with the philosophy of the person asking the question. Meaning people have different views of what's the point of economics, what's the point of economic growth. And there are two general schools of thought. I think if you're right of center, or maybe if you're centrist, you'd say, look, prosperity, that's what we want. We want economic growth. We want good things to happen. We want to make it as easy as possible for someone to get a job, for someone to get promoted, for businesses to expand. So we want, the best way to manage bad news, so to speak, is make good news as easy as possible. And you see dramatically, you can see today, the correlation between tax rates and economic growth. And you can look, all sort of charting data about jurisdictions in the United States, what their tax rates are, and what the unemployment rate is. And there's a very strong correlation. So if you accept that premise that the point of economic policy is to allow the conditions for economic growth, then you're for low taxes. But that is one school of thought. The other school of thought is, look, there's a lot of misery out there. There are poor folks out there, or folks' life isn't that successful or that happy. And the key to dealing with that misery is a government program. And we're going to make their lives better, or try to make it better by doing something for them. And the key to the government program is tax revenue. So the point of tax policy is not to facilitate economic growth or prosperity or allow jobs to be created. The point of tax policy is to get money so we can help folks who need help, which in the abstract has an appeal. And by the way, if you go back to the New Deal, you'd probably say, look, there's a lot of validity to this. I think what that leads out is, I was just having friends with a good friend, just having breakfast yesterday with a good friend on the left. I said the fundamental problem with this philosophy is you are a victim of your own success. That I remember reading Robert Caro's biography of LBJ, and he says LBJ became a New Dealer in the 1930s because of the Rural Electrification Administration. It's like 25% of U.S. households didn't have electricity. So your life is miserable. You have back-breaking work taking water from a well, and it's a tough life. So let's get the RA in, let's have low-cost loans, let's get people electrified, everybody has a better life. So you say, boy, that's pretty impressive. Yes, and anybody who lived through that would say, I'm all for that. Now, here we are 80 years later, they've got electricity. So that problem has been solved. You can have other kind of problems or issues, but to say these fundamental problems about allowing people to participate in the economy and society, go to school, have a better life, you've kind of tackled that. There's still certainly that bottom decile in America, I think, does have kind of a miserable life. So you ought to talk about what government programs. But I don't think it's accurate to say it is the paucity of government programs that allows for the miserable life. And indeed, if you look at the more expensive jurisdictions, D.C., I'm living in San Francisco, Chicago, you'd say, boy, poverty there seems to be more entrenched in expensive government jurisdictions than it is in Phoenix or Dallas or Miami or low-tax jurisdictions. So maybe there's a limit to what government can do, and maybe there's even second-order effects which are quite harmful to the population you're purporting to support. But that is the philosophical difference, I think, and Reagan was obviously in the first camp. The most important thing I can do is make prosperity as easy as possible to obtain. And we want a society that is fair and inclusive and allows people to go where they want to go. And we're going to have architecture that allows for that. We're going to have college education. We're going to have electricity. And we're going to have open markets. And we want everybody to have a happy, successful life. That was his view. But you're right. People are not always comfortable with that approach.
No, not at all. Yeah. I'm going to use moderator's prerogative here to extend the event just a little bit.
Okay,
so we have just a few minutes for maybe one or two audience questions. I know Frank will be around here after the event to chat with folks too. So in the back, Ava, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for this event. I am Ashley, a fellow Andover alum and PPO alum, so very excited to be here.
Great.
I am actually really curious. The subtitle of your book is about lessons for today, right? And I'd be really interested to hear sort of what lessons you have for us young people in the room about what lessons we should take from the Reagan era. I mean, you talk about economic prosperity, and I think one of the things that I think about when you talk about the expansion of electricity is now it's broadband, right? That people need internet in order to engage with the economy. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and look, I'm all for it. I guess I'd say if folks in Wyoming want 5G, the attribute of society and financial systems today is you can finance that. The state government can issue a bond, private lenders can loan you money, the internet companies themselves can finance it, right? But why is this a national policy requirement? And if you came to me and said 25% of the U.S. population doesn't have electricity, I think that is. Those people really have miserable lives, and if we hook them up to a grid, they can have a better life. I think I agree with you. So I'm not a pure libertarian. I wouldn't say we'll just wait over the coming generations, people will become prosperous to string their own electric wire. I'd say go ahead and fund that. But at some point you say there's no special role for the U.S. government, I think, in funding 5G. I mean, maybe I've got that wrong. I'm not an expert. But I think in general we've got financial infrastructure that they can do it. So, and if you're running for office, the rationale of your candidacy for office is, I'm going to bring you 5G. I just think that's misplaced. I think people say, I've got it, or I'm going to get it, or I'm okay with 4G, or I don't want to pay for 5G. I mean, so I think it's a very different appeal than saying I'm going to bring electricity to households who don't have electricity. So it's a question of sort of diminishing marginal returns and diminishing political saliency of these set of issues. If you say there's misery out there, there is, government can do something about it, maybe, but there's going to be diminishing returns to that equation, and some government programs might even have contrary consequences as well. But my lessons is sort of how we began this talk, to say, look, I think we're all better off in public life or in business life and personal life being able to express ourselves in a way that is inclusive, that is inviting. And you've got ideas, you've got goals, you want buy-in from other people, and it behooves you to respect your ideas by saying, how can I present these ideas in the most inviting way possible? And I want to try to build a consensus. I've got to listen to people who are skeptical or critical, or my idea costs too much, and I want to try to take their thoughts into the equation. But I want my idea to go ahead. So how do we engage in the I don't want to call it war of ideas, but it's sort of the conversation of ideas to allow people to. So that, I think, is a key attribute of leadership, is to be able to articulate that vision.
Thank you. Great question. Sorry, we only have time for maybe one more audience question. So I saw your hand raised when I first asked, and then we'll close it again. Frank will be here afterwards.
I'll be here.
So, sir, please go ahead. Microphone's right there.
Thank you. Yes, one of the things that was...
Go ahead, your name and affiliation.
Yes, yep. John Patrick. I'm also an Andover alum.
That's great.
So
that's great.
A bit before you, actually.
Okay. Oh, that's great.
One of the things that was no part of the president's vision coming into office, his strategic vision, but became part of it well into his presidency was, as you mentioned, SDI.
Yeah.
Were you in a position to have any insight as to how it was brought to the president's attention, who was talking to whom? Because it cropped up and he really latched onto it, but it was not part of his original vision.
No, you're right. It didn't even exist in 79, 8. Even the idea didn't exist. I'll tell you something, though, about Reagan, which I think is very American, regardless of, again, your political philosophy. I would make just a general point that America is the best place in the world to have an idea or to bring an idea because we are intrigued, because we respect the disruptor, we respect the innovator. We don't want to be we know if we're purely status quo, if we say what I need to do, what I need America to do next year is exactly what it's done this year, we're missing out. We're missing out on innovation, on tech, on changes in appetite, in international activity. So don't say my job as president is to lock in the present and make sure nothing ever changes. My job as a leader is to make sure we make the transition to whatever kind of economic changes or tech changes are in front of us, but do so in an orderly fashion so we're not scaring people or being reckless in that transition. So Reagan, at least culturally, was, I think, of the mindset to say, I get it. I get what's going on. I saw what radio did. I saw what movies did. I saw what television did. And the smart folks were the folks who figured that out, and the less smart folks were the folks said, I'm only going to do movies this way, and that's how the rest of the world's going to operate, and I don't have to change or adopt or think, right? So every industry and every social moray is subject to that kind of evolution. So I think you're completely correct that it wasn't front and center of him, but I think the cultural disposition of believing sort of America, believing in innovation, believing in adaptation was very much part of his life and his mental framework.
Thank you for the question. We, again, Frank will be here afterwards to chat with everybody. I want to close on this. There's a lot we couldn't get to. We could have gone on for another 2 hours. Maybe the most vexing question of all, how to explain Ronald Reagan the man. And I love that you close the book with a chapter titled "Searching for Jupiter." Yeah. It's not an easy question. I don't think it's an easy question to ask of any president. Yeah. But I want to just recite a couple quotes here that you include in the book. First, Nancy Reagan. He is exactly the man he appears to be. The Ronald Reagan you see in public is the same Ronald Reagan I live with. But then she also wrote, there's a wall around him. He lets me come closer than anyone else, but there are times when even I feel that barrier. You wrote, working with Reagan across 8 years, I saw many layers and facets, all carefully guarded by a genial public persona and honed over years in the public eye. And he is friendly with everyone, friends with no one. So who was Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, I think all of those things. By the way, I was always kind of impressed with this. And part of it, at least, was that Hollywood pedigree. That the general public always wants more from you than you can provide. Demand always exceeds supply. The fans, this is America. So people are completely unabashed about going up to a movie star and saying, not just saying, hey, I really enjoyed your last movie, but saying, I've got questions and I want to discuss it, and why didn't you date the first girl, you dated the second girl? And I said, look, I didn't write the movie, and by the way, this was entertainment. There's not necessarily a reason for any of this stuff, but anyhow, I can't have these conversations with everybody who has a question about my movie. So you refine an approach that is genial as can be, as friendly as can be, and highly efficient. Highly efficient. My goal is to be your best friend and get you the hell out of here quickly, because I got to do my job, and I can't spend a lot of time talking about, your theory of movies. So he was very good at that. Everybody gets a smile, everybody gets a hearing, and everybody gets out the door. And I think, though, if you carry it too far, you're saying, there probably are some people in your orbit who would be good friends. And you do need to write. Now, he did have those. The other attribute, though, I'd say that led me to my conclusion is that his peer group was aged. The kitchen cabinet, the California crowd, the folks who actually would sit down. You know, just think of something happens in your life that's weird, unsettling or unplanned or unhelpful, and you would say, I got to just go see this person. I got to go see my old friend or my cousin or whatever. My old boss was always pretty cool, and I got to just share this with him and say, what do you think? And that's how we view friendship, as a reservoir of goodwill and trust and insight that can help us in a challenging moment. And unfortunately for Reagan, a lot of that really faded. The people weren't around anymore or weren't physically proximate. He loved his wife. He loved Nancy. She was great. There's another quote. Michael Reagan said, the son, said, you know, this question about is the glass half full or half empty. My dad would always say the glass is half full. He's always the opposite. The glass is half full. My mom would always say, who stole that half glass from my dad? So she was always sort of skeptical or protective, right? And he was always sort of the optimist. But knowing the individual, do I have time? 1 minute for this?
Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. The last campaign swing of Ronald Reagan was Election Day 88. He is doing everything he can to help Vice President George Bush beat Michael Dukakis, right? And he's doing a lot of work, especially California stops and swings. Bush ends up carrying California great. Reagan comes, so his last campaign activity is the day before election, as you expect. Election day, he flies back to the White House, lands at Andrews, helicopter to the South Lawn. And that's his final campaign moment as president. And what we always did when the president lands South Lawn is we always got staff out to greet him and welcome back. And part of that's just that good footage. It's good footage. The president returned today to the White House, blah, 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 and you get people applauding, and people hold signs. So I said to my team, I'm in the political office, a little mischievously, let's have a contest. Who can create a sign that is going to induce the president to come over? And by the way, he always did. I think most presidents, all presidents do that. You know, you chat with folks for a minute or two and you go on. So think of something to say. Think of something to say that's sort of historical moment, and it's got to fit on a sign, and you can pull them over. And so we all sort of took the bet, and every sign, more or less, was what you'd expect. Win one for the Gipper, Reagan, Hart, Bush, 4 more years. General, you know, unimaginative, but, you know, adequate for the moment kind of messaging. And the guy who won the contest was my intern, and he didn't do any of that. His sign said, "Will you be my grandpa?" I thought this was extraordinary. I really reflected on this. I thought this was extraordinary because there's part of the president who says, look, the transactional business of politics is less important than the human dimension. And I've got a kid here. He didn't, by the way, he wouldn't have known that's the intern. He would obviously, he's part of the broader White House family, but he wouldn't have known who the guy is. But I've got a kid on my front lawn, my back lawn, who has a hole in him, has a problem. To such an extent, he's asking me to help with that problem. And it's a human problem. And I don't know the story, I don't know the situation, I don't know what caused it. But I've got the greatest gift a person can give, which is the gift of kindness. And I can do it. And rather than go to the political folks who are saying, you know, win this election, let me go to the kid who's asking for my help. And let me just chat with him. And I have the ability to make him feel a little better. And that's what I'm going to do. So I thought that was magnificent. I thought that was extraordinary testimony to the individual.
That's a perfect way to end.
Perfect way to end. Thank you, Alex.
Frank, thank you very much. It's a fantastic book. Thank you all for joining us today inside the Reagan White House.
I've got a book for you, and if you want, I do have some extra books if you're interested in purchasing.
Wonderful.
So good. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks.